This is Clark the Knife, and this is the Spyderco Bodacious. This is a newly released knife from Spyderco, which is clearly their successor to the Spyderco Shaman. They took the Shaman, which was a big hit from a few years ago, made it thinner blade stock, 125 thousandths on stock instead of 145, flattened the scales instead of having those big rounded contoured scales. These are now flat, in fact smooth, G10 scales. Got rid of the choil, brought the sharpened edge all the way back to the base of the blade, and with that you have a Bodacious. I'm going to go through this review in 3 parts, as I always do. First, we're going to go through some specifications and talk about the features of the knife tip to tail. Then I'm going to give it a score on a 10-point scale. And finally, I'll summarize with what I do and don't like most about the knife to sort of give you my big picture thoughts. Let's get to it. So let's start with some specifications here on the Spyderco Bodacious. Now, this is still a large knife. This is a knife that they made thinner than the Shaman, but they did not really make smaller than the Shaman. This is still a 3.66 inch blade made of S30V. You can see you're still made in USA, Golden, Colorado earth right there. Still designed by Sal Glesser. There's your S30V right there, Spyderco. There's your laser etched Spyderco logo. Blade stock, as I mentioned already, 125 thousandths, so about 15% thinner than your Spyderco Shaman. 8.27 inches long overall. Still a chunky knife at 4.8 ounces. We will talk about that later. And like virtually every compression lock Spyderco, this is running on washers for the pivot. The Spyderco Bodacious made in the USA and runs $262 retail. And yes, we are going to talk about that price as well. Let's get some size comparisons before we start going into things. I will say I will not have a direct comparison to a Shaman because I don't own a Shaman. My Shaman review was quite a while back, but suffice it to say I am not a big fan of the Spyderco Shaman. So do take this review with that in mind. I'm a big fan of the Native, but I am not a big fan of the Shaman. I find that it is too big and too chunky to really be useful and just feels ungainly in the hand. But the size here is going to be pretty similar to what you would expect from the Shaman. It is a knife that is almost the exact same length overall as the PM2, while being, as you can see, a significantly taller and just chunkier knife. There's just more to it, which is also why this one is about an ounce heavier than the PM2. One thing we'll start looking at here is the blade stock. The Shaman had the same blade stock thickness as the PM2. You can see that the Bodacious here is significantly thinner than your PM2. And if you look out at the tip, you can see that the PM2 still has more distal taper, so the tip on that Shaman is a little thicker. That's just the way they sort of run the blade. You know, you've got your flat carried all the way out about 2/3 of the way down the length of that blade for the Shaman. Let's compare to a couple other prominent knives. There it is compared to your Benchmade 940. Again, this is a large knife, mostly in this sort of tallness dimension and its overall bigness, not necessarily in length. It's a standard, full-size knife in terms of length, but it's not huge in terms of length. It's just big overall. Let's compare it to an XM18. This is a skinny. Review coming up on this one soon. This is a skinny XM18, and you can see it is actually extremely similar in size overall to the XM18. Very similar in weight as well to this skinny version here. And then again, when you look at the blade stock, you can see, it's a bit hard to see with the swedge on the hinderer, but you can see it a bit better if you look at where the jimping is there. You can see the blade stock on the Bodacious is a good bit thinner than the blade stock on even a skinny hinderer. Anything else that we want to do here? Let's just, because this is becoming a knife that a lot of people know, let's compare it to your AD20S, and you will see very similar knife overall in size to the AD20S. Actually, just in terms of length, almost identical. In terms of overall chunkiness, almost identical. Obviously, very different sort of contours and shaping on the blades and the handles here. Also, very similar blade stock thickness. Very similar at the tip. These two knives, obviously, they're operating at very different price points. This is a $400 to $450 knife. This is a $250 knife. But very similar size and overall sort of profile. They also feel very different in the hand, but my 8020S review is coming up. So those are the size comparisons for your Bodacious. It is a big knife. Not huge, but the fact that they've thinned it out has not made it a small knife by any stretch. Now let's go through the features here. The blade, very similar in design to the Shaman. This is a traditional Spyderco leaf-shaped blade. A little bit of that sort of Bob Lum heritage here in a way. You've got a big drop point to take the tip just below that pivot. It might be, no, it's definitely below the pivot, a little bit below the pivot, so huge drop point there. Not technically a full flat grind, because you do have that saber right there, taking that flat out about 2/3 of the length of the blade, but it does have plenty of space to drop down to that cutting edge, and at 125 thousandths for the blade stock, there's a lot of space to come down to a relatively thin edge if they were to grind it aggressively. You've got all belly here on the bottom. I guess a little bit of flat back here. And then you've got your plunge right here, sort of Spyderco Golden Colorado signature sharp plunge there. And, this Spyderco leaf shape, it's a slightly exaggerated drop point. There's a drop point that's a little droppier than most drop points, and Spyderco uses this shape a ton because it's a very versatile blade shape. All this belly, very nice for your long cuts for things. The tip isn't all the way down for something like a Warncliffe, so you can still, get that tip around. You're going into a branch, you're going into something down on the table, things like that. You can still get that tip where you need it. This is a blade that is relatively easy to pinch up on. Golden Colorado, as is typical here, doesn't really knock down the edges on their spider holes. So it is pretty grabby there. And if you want to pinch up on this blade, you can absolutely pinch in that spider hole and get right up on the blade there for your detailed cuts. Hold something in your hand and just cut into it, carve into it just like that. You've got some pretty solid jimping here on the back of this blade. This is absolutely functional jimping. Golden Colorado cuts their jimping pretty sharp there, as you can see. And it runs a little bit back into the handle right there. Honestly, it is a pretty similar blade experience to the Shaman, just it slices a little bit better than the Shaman because the stock is thinner. It's also a little bit lighter than the Shaman. One of the sort of most distinctive features of the Shaman, which I was not a big fan of, was how heavy the blade on the Shaman is. This is a blade shape that carries a lot of blade thickness all the way up to the tip, and it's a very tall blade. You can see here, even when it starts to taper, there's a lot of blade stock, even out to the tip. This is a heavy blade. This is a big blade for 125 thousandths of blade stock, and it still is and feels heavy. You feel that weight on the open. When you're pushing it here, you feel that when you're overcoming that detent. You even feel it in your hand a little bit when you kick that out. It kicks a little bit in your hand because this blade is still heavy. It's not as extreme as it was on the Shaman, which really felt like a heavy blade. This here, it feels like a much lighter blade because it's just 20% thinner throughout the whole blade stock. So it's going to be a 20% lighter blade, and that makes a big difference, 15% more than 20%. But other than that, just about the same blade as the Shaman. Only difference is the Shaman did have that choil that you could choke up on. That is now gone. The edge runs all the way back to the bottom of that plunge. Before we get back to the handle here, one thing to note, the much maligned nub that sticks out in the Shaman, which was a consequence of that choil right here, is no longer there on the Bodacious. So when you are closing this, Anybody who's had a Shaman knows there's usually that nub that sticks out there that pops into the compression lock access area. That is no longer there. You don't have to worry about that with the Bodacious. That's cool. Handles here. The handles on this first version, and you know this is going to come out in a million sprints and things like that, but the handles on this first version are smooth G10. If you've ever had any of the Knife Center exclusive Spydercos in black G10, this is the same smooth G10 pattern. It's not slick, but there's no peel ply texture on here. You've got a nice even chamfer all the way around the edge here. All your screws are nicely flush except for the one holding the stop pin, which is a little bit proud, just like it was with the Shaman. And this isn't a screw, this is just a pin sitting between the scales. A little more proud on this side than that side. You've got your compression lock access right here. Typical, press the button and the blade drops. Works like every other compression lock out there. This one does have a back spacer rather than standoffs. I assume that is probably to help the knife feel more balanced in the hand, to just shift a bit of that weight back toward the butt. And it does feel nicely balanced. Your balance point is right in the middle of that front finger index, which means that when you hold this knife in the hand, in this grip, it feels quite natural. The curves are not too aggressive. You basically got a big front finger index here, a little belly sort of swoop there, and then another sort of swoop back here. And the same general lines as the Shaman, obviously with the differences up here because of the removal of that front finger choil, but a nice gradual curve across the back. It's a nice neutral handle. This back rolls nicely into your palm. The chamfers on the edge of the G10 here, these feel nice in the hand. There's no sharp spots. Nice big flat on the bottom. So when you grip down on it, it doesn't want to roll in your hand at all because you're sort of gripping down on these flats. And if it tries to roll, then these flat parts keep it in your hand. Combine that with your thumb landing on this nice sharp jimping. This is a nice secure grip. This feels very good in the hand. This is the grip that the Shaman sort of most wants to be used in. You can also pinch up, again, use that spidey hole, use those sharp edges, pinch up on the blade here for your more delicate cuts, and then the rest of your fingers run right into that front finger index. It's a nicely designed, simple handle, and I will tell you, with these flat scales rather than the sort of big round, basically the difference is, the Shaman scales were flat on the flats here, but they had these huge rounded contours that almost made them feel like contoured scales. If you took, this radius here and made it like 5 times larger, they were visibly rounded. I found that made it feel big and chunky in the hand, and it also made it feel like it could roll quite a bit when you started to torque on it. Those problems are gone. This thing is slimmer in the hand than the Shaman. It feels to me even more secure in the hand than the Shaman while being no less comfortable. I actually find it even a little bit more comfortable because I find comfort in security, and I find that this feels a little bit more secure in my hand than the Shaman ever did. Frankly, this lighter blade also helps because the whole thing doesn't feel as blade heavy. It feels a little bit more handle heavy, so I feel a little bit more in control. Other than that, this is very much the same experience as the Shaman. Typical compression lock action. You press your compression lock here and it will, it'll drop shut if you give it a good shake. Hard to do under the camera. But if I give it a good shake, it will sort of fling shut like that. Your detent, typical Spyderco 2024 detent. Put your thumb in that spider hole right there, and it will flick out nicely and reliably. I haven't been using this one this much. I've used it for, a handful of days. I've used it pretty aggressively those handful of days. This will probably keep breaking in a little bit further if I were to use it more. But it feels like you would expect from a slightly lighter Shaman. The action feels similar with that lighter blade as you would expect. So that's sort of my overall, that's tip to tail what's going on with the Bodacious. I guess last thing's typical Spyderco spoon clip, nothing to write home about. Big fat lanyard hole in the back. Let's go right into the scores. And these scores honestly were a little surprising to me, but it's my honest assessment of the knife. And as you will start to see as you look through here, I'm not as big a fan of this knife as I thought I was going to be. I score on a 10-point scale, or 10 scoring areas. 5 of them are related to fun factor, basically how cool is this knife, and 5 of them are related to utility, how easy and useful, how easy is this knife to use, how useful is this knife. Let's start with fun factor. Distinctiveness. This is a plain G10 knife with S30V, and it's sort of this native profile, and it's Spyderco's native profile, which is cool. It's got that little bit of Bobolum sort of heritage. It's a pretty typical Salglasser design, but there's nothing that interesting about this knife, and the fact that it is from this angle, it kind of looks like a carbon copy of the Shaman with the sharpening choil removed. If the Shaman didn't exist, this would probably be a 7, maybe even an 8. But the fact that they really did just, take, okay, this is the Shaman 2.0. There's nothing that distinctive about this knife. There's nothing, when you look at this knife, that makes it feel like there isn't anything else out there, because there are a lot of knives with leaf-shaped blades out there from Spyderco and otherwise, and this is very, very similar to the Shaman in a lot of ways. Design. That's a 7. I do like all of the design changes that they made relative to the Shaman. I do think that virtually every change they made for this knife relative to the Shaman is an improvement. I like the fact that they didn't just slim the scales, or they didn't just slim the blade, but they slimmed the scales, and they slimmed the feel of the scales by making them flat. That was a really good choice. It helped make this feel secure in the hand while still being a thinner knife. I like the fact that they removed the front finger choil. I would have liked to have been able to grab it like this. It would have been nice. But aesthetically, I like the knife better without that front finger choil. And it is nice as you really push through stuff to have that full blade edge for those longer cuts as you go. When I use this in the garden, around the house, things like that, having that full blade edge is nice. Also, not having to worry about anything getting caught in a choil is nice. The lines are, again, the same as the Shaman. They are nice and pleasant. This is a nice gradual swoop across the back. All the curves complement each other nicely. It's a nice, simple design. There's nothing interesting about it, but it's functional. So that's a solid 7. Action. This is a 2024 Spyderco compression lock, meaning it, drops shut nicely, nice solid detent, nice detent to overcome, flicks out, shakes shut. It works. It's cool that it's on washers. It's cool that you get that drop shutty action on bearings. Functional is really the way that I can describe it. You do get, a slightly heavier feeling action than you would with something like a PM2, just because this does have a lighter blade and you feel that. So something like a PM2 feels a little bit more fidgety. This still, even with the thinner blade stock, still feels a little heavier to open, heavier to close than the PM2. That's more of a preference thing. I personally don't like it. I like the blade feeling a little bit lighter on a compression lock, but that's a preference thing. Not going to put points again at 7 for the action. Fit and finish, I mentioned this in other Spyderco reviews. Golden Colorado Spyderco in 2024 is doing nothing ambitious with their fit and finish, but they're doing everything well. Their grinds are very pretty. This is a very nice machine satin. All of the etching is very nice. Everything is nicely flush here. Your edges are nicely chamfered. The compression lock is set in nicely. Everything is nice and flush. Your jimping is great. Your plunge is very nicely cut. Everything here is solid. They're not trying to do anything complicated. They're not trying to do anything impressive in this knife. They're doing everything well. That's a 7. And cool factor here is a 6. This is a kind of boring knife. It is cool in the sense that if you like knives that are very sort of purpose-built, very utilitarian, there is some coolness in that. And honestly, a big leaf-shaped blade does look kind of cool. The spider hole always is a nice sort of design touch. It doesn't look bad anywhere, but you're not carrying this knife because there's anything that like wows you about this. If you're carrying this knife, it's because you like the way it feels to use. And you know, the overall sort of package, it's not ugly, it's not unimpressive, it's just basic. So I can't even give it really a 7 in cool factor because there's nothing cool about it. But there's nothing offensive. So I'm going to call it a 6 in cool factor, and that gives us 33 points for fun factor. Honestly, I don't think anybody would have expected this to be a particularly fun knife, especially in this initial G10 and S30V iteration. Which brings us to utility, and this is the area. These are the areas where I thought the Bodacious was going to do a little better. First one, and this is probably my biggest disappointment with the Bodacious cutting performance. This is a 7. A 7 is not a bad score, but the fact is, I really thought with 125 thousandths blade stock and all of this space to drop, that this was going to be a really good cutter. That this was going to slice like crazy. There were 2 reasons that it wasn't. First, the factory edge that it came with kinda sucked. This is my edge on there now, because I did try to get more performance out of this knife. The factory edge just didn't cut all that well. But even with my 17-degree edge on here, the cutting performance is fine. The Shaman, because of that thick blade stock and because the blade was just so damn big, when you tried to do anything other than hard-use tasks with it, you felt like you were dragging a big piece of metal through whatever you were cutting. If you were trying to cut cardboard, if you were trying to, you know, especially go through something that didn't have a lot of give, like, you know, trying to cut through twigs, bark, things like that, trying to cut through certain kinds of carpet, all that sort of stuff. It would be great as long as the material could kind of flex, but I distinctly remember cutting a bunch of carpet up with my 15V Shaman, and the second that the carpet, you know, lost its ability because of where I was cutting it, lost ability to move, the knife bound up because it was a big, thick stock pushing through everything. Even though there was still cutting performance at the edge, the stock was just thick. I really thought this 125,000 stock would fix a lot of those problems, but frankly, the cutting performance on the Bodacious isn't a lot better than the Shaman. It is a little bit better, and especially on fine tasks like, you know, cutting, if you use this for food prep or you use this for delicate plant material, use this for cutting boxes, lighter cardboard, things like that. This is going to feel a bit slicier than the Shaman, but it's still far from an elite slicer. And it is significantly less slicey for reasons that I don't quite understand. It's significantly less slicey than things like my natives. Things like a lot of my Tai Chung Spydercos, things like a lot of my Seki City Spydercos. I understand why it's less slicey than the Seki Cities. Those have thinner blades. But honestly, I think this grind, and you can sort of see in how flat that plunge is, this grind just doesn't feel all that aggressive. And so it's still kind of chunky at the edge. A 7 is not a bad score for cutting performance, but I really thought the Bodacious was going to have a greater improvement in cutting performance relative to the Shaman than it does. Robustness, 7. This is a pretty tough knife. This is a borderline 8. The fact is, 125 thousandths versus 145 thousandths in modern super steels, you're not really giving up that much toughness. 125 thousandths is thick enough unless you are doing the kind of stupid things that you really should be using a fixed blade for. Especially when you've got a blade design that carries that stock thickness all the way out. In fact, you know what? I'm going to make a game time decision, and I am going to, well, I seem to have lost my marker, but I am going to make that backup marker. There we go. Backup marker, this is going to be an 8. The fact is, this is tougher than most knives out there, and I shouldn't really penalize it, because honestly, this knife is still just about as tough as the Shaman. It's less heavy, which is great, but the changes that they made, all of that makes it no less tough. You can still use this thing hard. And honestly, if you really think that that 15% decrease in blade stock makes any difference whatsoever, that just feels a little bit outdated. given how tough most steels are these days. And again, anything that really is going to be at the point where it would be risk snapping this blade or snapping this edge or anything like that, you probably should be using a fixie. So I'm going to call that an 8. This is a tough knife still. Carry is a 7, borderline 6. Actually, not even borderline. I'm going to counteract, and I'm going to make this a lot of game time changes on this one. Okay, so we're going to make this a 33, and we're going to make this a 66. The problem, one of my biggest problems with the Bodacious is because they didn't change the overall profile, this is still a huge knife in the pocket. I mean, compared to the PM2, like the PM2 is a notoriously large carry. Not because on this dimension, but because on this dimension, and the Bodacious still dwarfs it when it's in the position you're going to carry it in. They did make it thinner. It's not that much thinner. It's only, 15% thinner as a knife. It's still a huge profile, and it's still heavy. Like 4.8 ounces for 3.5 inches of blade and change. That's still a very heavy knife. This still feels like it takes up a ton of space in your pocket. And with these edges being relatively sharp, I mean, not sharp in the sense that they're going to grab on anything, but in the sense that it's not like a contoured knife where this slides past things easily. This is still a knife that takes up a whole pocket. It's not egregiously big and heavy. Like the Shaman is a 5 or a 4 in carry for me, but it's still a big knife. And part of the reason that I've kind of hated carrying this for review is because I just don't want to carry anything else in my pocket next to the Bodacious, and it's not like I'm getting extraordinary cutting performance for it. So that's a 6. That number right there is a 6 for carry. Feel and ergos, another thing that's kind of disappointing for the Bodacious. Again, this grip, very good. The big issue with feel is how tall this blade is. A blade that is this tall is awesome if it does one thing, which is it lets you use all this space to drop to get insane cutting performance at the edge. That's what you can really do when you've got a blade this tall. You don't have insane cutting performance at the edge, so all you've got is a really big blade. And there's a problem with a big blade, which is that it is hard to get in and around things. A lot of the knives, in fact, I'll take out the last knife I reviewed right before this, your 710. Skinny blade. There's a lot of things I didn't like about this blade. It's just not that sharp for one thing, and the recurve is doing all the work. But the great thing about a skinny blade like this is you can get it in and around stuff so easily. You can get this blade wherever you want to, whatever you're doing. This guy, especially if you're working in tight spaces, which I often do in the ways that I use my knives, I'm either trying to get right between a couple things. Again, the primary place I use a lot of my knives is in the garden, or at least that's where I get a lot of my use. And I'm trying to get around particular, plant stems or getting in between roots and things like that. A blade this big is really hard to navigate in tight spaces. I've seen the same thing with EDC stuff. If I want to, just get right around, if I'm trying to cut something, like behind a table, or I'm trying to, cut something in a tight space, a blade this big is awkward to use. Same thing when you've got, let me take out my 940. The other upside of a small blade, I'll phrase it that way, is that this is nimble in the cut. As I am cutting, it's easy for me to, and you've all felt this when you cut cardboard, it's easy for me to adjust this blade, twist it, turn it, as it goes through the cut. It flows through that cut nicely. This big old brick doesn't. Once you initiate that cut, you're stuck at that angle. This thing does not want to rotate in the cut whatsoever. Ergos on the handle are very good. It's a very solid handle. It's big, so it fills the hand nicely. It being a little bit more handle heavy works well. It feels nice and secure in the hand. But it kind of feels, and this goes with the big chunky carry, it kind of feels like it's restricted a little bit to big knife tasks. It almost feels like a sort of restricted to hard use knife. in a way that I don't even get with some other big knives. If I compare this to, so for example, your Demco AD20S. If you look at, let me just pull this out of the way here. If you look at how big these blades are toward the tip, and this is your slicer profile, if I put this in front, you'll see, actually they are about the same, honestly, but you've got a little bit thinner stock on the AD20S. Honestly, it might just be the choil that makes the difference, because I do find this one a lot easier to navigate in tight spaces. So maybe that is the result of the loss of the choil. As I will tell you, my experience with using this is that this Bodacious has been a pain to use in small tasks. It has felt like too much knife for small tasks, and I think that is a combination of how big the blade is, and that is probably a consequence of the lack of that choil. It just feels like a lot of blade. It's a 6. It gets positive points because this handle is very good for, you know, when you want to run through a bunch of carpets, when you want to chop down onto something. If you're planning to exclusively use this knife for large tasks, then call this a 7, call this an 8, but it feels strange almost to thin this knife out, to slim it out, while making it honestly no better really at EDC tasks than the Shaman was. And then value here, this is a 6, and it's only not a 5 because there's been some really bad values out there in the knife industry recently. Spyderco is really starting to push prices with $262 for this knife. That felt painful in a way that Spyderco's really didn't feel painful a couple of years ago. All the knives that I review, I buy with my own money. I have no loaners, and I don't really plan to accept loaners. If I ever do, it won't be from Chinese companies and stuff like that. No, a Nick Shabazz style disclosure. But right now, everything that I buy for review, I buy with my own money. And then I sell it on the secondary market to recoup as much as I can. This really felt painful to drop $262 on this knife. Especially, you know, when these are aftermarket scales, but when you can still get a PM2 for $180, sometimes even a bit less than that if you've got the right retailer, in the same configuration, you know, in your S30V and G10 configuration. The Bodacious feels expensive. It feels expensive for a Spyderco, and it feels expensive for a knife for what you're getting here. It is made in the USA, and the fact is, it's not like there are made in the USA knives at this level of quality and fit and finish that are significantly cheaper than $262. But the fact is, you're getting a steel that is a fine steel. I'm not being a steel snob here. I like Spyderco's S30V. It holds an edge well. It's relatively corrosion resistant. It's tough enough. But basic G10 scales here. There's a pretty basic pattern. S30V, which is a fine steel, but it's a cheap steel. $262 is starting to feel expensive, especially when you add on tax and all that sort of stuff. Spyderco knives are really starting to feel like less of a value. I know I'm far from the first person to say that, but it's just, it's getting tough. It's getting tough. Not that I've got necessarily that much better alternatives if this is the sort of knife you want, but it's just starting to feel expensive. Put it this way. This is now not that close to, or not that far away from something like the Mini Adamas from Benchmade. And when you're a large-scale manufacturer and you're starting to approach Benchmade prices, you know that you're starting to get expensive. So, sum it all up, you might have seen here, the Bodacious gets a 66, which is not a great score. And this ends up being a knife, and you see it in the scores. It's not terrible at anything. There's no 5s here. There's no 4s here. But it's also not great at anything. It's a tough knife. It gets that 8 in robustness, but there's nothing about this knife that is impressive. And that's part of the problem in what they've ended up doing in changing this from the Shaman. The Shaman did have a really clear reason to exist, in that if you are one of those kind of buffoony people that want a knife that is as tough as a fixed blade, the Shaman was, at the time it came out, about as tough as you were going to get for a knife without going to a company that specialized in that, like Strider or Hinder or somebody like that. And frankly, it was offering that level of toughness at a much lower price point. That marketplace is a lot more competitive these days, again, if you're willing to go to that $400, $450 price point. But the Shaman at least had a good reason to exist, and there was a cool factor around a knife as tough as the Shaman. The Bodacious here is, if anything, less tough than the Shaman. Again, I really don't think that slimming out the stock 15% and making the scales flat actually makes it any less tough. But it certainly doesn't have that big brawny feel as much, but it's also no better, really, at any of the stuff the Shaman was bad at. It's not that much easier to carry. It doesn't cut that much better. I like it better in the hand. All the differences between this and the Shaman, for me personally, are positive ones. I like it better in the hand. It does cut a little bit better. Again, with that, now that I really think about it, I do kind of miss that sharpening or that finger choil there. I probably would like this blade performance a little bit better if I could get that close up to the blade. But it kind of feels like a knife that's just floating in between a couple use cases. It's still not light enough to be a true EDC knife. It's still not heavy enough to really compete with like Hinder or somebody like that as a big tough knife. Or it's not heavy duty enough. It's not fidgety enough to be a fidget king. It's not cheap enough to be a budget option. It's not nice enough to be anything that's sort of pretty or cool or anything like that. It's just kind of blasé. If this had been the first version if this had come out before the Shaman, I probably would be a little bit more favorable to it. And I do think that this is a better knife than the Shaman. But still, even if the Shaman didn't exist, it's hard for me to figure out why I would get a Bodacious rather than just getting a PM2. There's nothing that I would rather do with the Bodacious that I can't do with the PM2. Overall, if you look at thickness in the pocket, they're about the same. If you look at weight, the PM2 is lighter. If you look at blade performance, I find that this one cuts a little bit better. Certainly the blade shape is, if anything, more useful. The ergonomics, for me, are significantly better on the PM2. The carry is a lot better. It's smaller. It's lighter. I just don't quite know what the Bodacious's reason to exist is, other than if you really like the Shaman and want something that's slimmer, lighter, and easier to carry, then it's great. But as a knife in and of itself, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But there's also nothing to write home about. And so, if I come back with my final summary here, and I'll make this quick because this is already longer than I wanted. Negatives, the factory edge sucked. It kind of sucks to carry because it's still big and chunky and takes up a lot of space in the pocket. The blade is bigger than I would like, and so it ends up being difficult to navigate around tasks other than those big heavy use tasks. And Spyderco prices are really starting to get tougher and tougher to justify. The blade performance is neutral. This cuts better than the Shaman, but it still doesn't cut well. And frustratingly, it cuts worse than a lot of other Spydercos. I was disappointed with the blade performance, not because it was bad, but because I really thought that this Bodacious would be a step up in blade performance from the Shaman, and it wasn't. And the toughness is fine. This is still a very tough knife, though it is now no longer, it doesn't feel as much a overtly hard use knife, and now it just feels sort of like a very tough EDC. The positive is that all the differences between this and the Shaman, I do think, are positive unless you want that heavy-duty feel. This is a slightly more versatile knife than the Shaman, but it also just, the Shaman was sort of a purpose-built heavy-duty tool, and this is just kind of there. So that's unfortunately my review of the Spyderco Bodacious. This was a knife that every single time I carried it, I tried really hard to find a way to like this knife. But every single time I started using it, I could not wait until I got to use the next knife in my pocket. Because as I've mentioned in some of my other reviews, anytime I'm carrying knives for review, I carry 2 or 3 knives in my pocket. Usually I carry one that I know I really like as sort of something, one, if I hate the other 2 knives that I'm testing for review, I've got something that can at least get cutting tasks done. And 2, so I can get a constant reminder, okay, this is what a good knife feels like. This was, usually I'll carry 3 just for the times that I'm carrying stuff to test it, to review it. Every single time I was carrying this, it was my least favorite knife I was carrying. I just did not enjoy the Bodacious. I didn't enjoy carrying it. I didn't enjoy using it. And nothing about it really excites me. I thought I was going to like it a lot more, but I didn't. So your mileage may vary. A lot of people love the Shaman, and this really could just be a function of the fact that I don't like this platform. It's strange to me because I love the Native. The Native is one of my favorite small knives. I'm still hanging on to my much patinaed Native 5. This is a fantastic small knife. This is a kind of mediocre big knife. Anyway, I think that's all I've got to say on the Bodacious. Obviously, this will come out in various sprint runs and stuff like that in the future. Some of those might be a bit more compelling, especially from the price point perspective, but this one as it stands here, if you like the Shaman and you want a slimmer Shaman, go for it. Otherwise, it's a little bit hard to recommend, especially at $262. At $200, I can consider maybe taking a flyer on it because it might just be fun for some people to have a blade this big. At $262, just get another PM2 instead. Honestly, that you're probably gonna like it more. Frankly, you can get a PM2 and some aftermarket scales for the price of this, and you'll probably be happier with that. That's the Bodacious. Wish I liked it more, but I don't. There will be some more positive reviews coming up. I know this one and the 710 review were both relatively negative. I do still enjoy knives. It's just these 2 were not it for me. Hope you found that helpful. Hope you found it useful. I do try to be honest. And most importantly, and I'll talk about my reviewing philosophy. I'll do a video just on that. But I really, even with the scoring system, I do believe in being a subjective reviewer. I don't think that being objective is something that reviewers should strive for. My goal, you've got different reviewers with different perspectives. You know, if you want a review about a big heavy knife, go to Metal Complex for that. If you want something about something that's light and precise, you go to Everyday Commentary for that. If you want something that's fidgety, you go to like Lefty EDC, somebody like that. And that's what they care about. I really care about everyday utility, versatility, how much do I enjoy using this, and how much satisfaction does it bring me as an object. That's my perspective. That's what I prioritize, and I want you to be able to come to me for that utilitarian perspective. That means that there are going to be some knives that other people love that I don't. That is a feature, not a bug. And I hope that you can come to me for a reliable take within that perspective. And I'm not going to try to, talk objectively about whether this is a good knife or not. I'm talking about whether this, to me, is a useful and interesting and satisfying knife. Not whether it is objectively good, because I think when you try to be objective, it's a fool's errand and you end up just putting subjectivity into it without realizing it. That's a discussion for another day. Anyway, this has been Clark the Knife with the Spyderco Bodacious. Not my favorite. Hope you like it more. Leave your thoughts down in the comments, and I will see you again soon.